You're listening to the Grounded Presence Podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Powell, and what I like to do here on the Grounded Presence Podcast is explore the matters of authentic identity, deep community, and the ever-evolving spiritual journey. And today we're going to do all of that and so much more. I've got a special guest joining me by the name of Dobson. Now, if you already know this man's name, you know we're going to have a lot of fun diving into the deep end on today's show. But if you're not already familiar with him, basically, he's a former Christian megachurch pastor who stepped down from his position leading a church about 5 years ago. And after that, it took him a little bit of soul searching and time to find his next calling, so to speak. But currently, he's now leading spiritual retreats in wild and natural spaces. And although he has a background as a Christian teacher, Kent's recent work centers more on the spiritual journey through a psycho-spiritual cultural lens than rather on Christian theology. And he's also an author, a podcaster, and a speaker. And I'm always drawn to anything Kent does because he's just got this really unique way of thinking about spirituality and religious symbolism in the Western society that most of us find ourselves in. And a quick aside before I kick it off here, I know this episode is a week late, and I am trying to keep up with my normal bi-weekly release schedule. But as I mentioned on the previous podcast, lately I've been working on a much larger project for the show. It's a full season of content based around a theme that I think you're really going to enjoy. So over the next few months, the release schedule will probably be a bit more choppy than I'd like it to be because the season I'm working on is taking a lot of time and a lot of energy. But I think you're really going to dig it, and I think it's going to be well worth it in the long run. But back to today's episode. You might hear some additional noises in the background from my office chair, so sorry about that in advance. I really have to pick up a can of WD-40 or something, but let's just call it some added ambiance this time, and bear with me through the additional noise. Well, let's get it started, and I think you're really going to love this guy, Dobson, and what he has to say. Well, hey, man, thanks for taking the time to talk today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for asking. I'm glad it worked out.
Yeah, me too. I just saw on your social media, you just got back from leading one of these wilderness retreats that you do out in Washington.
Yeah. So I've been the last few years leading retreats that I call wilderness within. So it's a little bit of taking people out to wild places, wild spaces, and practices, conversation, spiritual work. It's very enjoyable. It's one of the more rewarding things that I've been privileged to do, at least in the last few years.
That's awesome. And it looked like it was in a beautiful setting up there in Washington.
Yeah, I was just in the Cascades. It was actually the weather was outstanding. It's a bit iffy this time of year in the mountains anyway, any mountains. But we had a little rain, but at higher elevations it snowed. It was just really beautiful, stunning.
Cool. That sounds awesome.
Mm-hmm.
So a little brief background for like listeners that aren't familiar with you yet. So you're basically, over the past 5 years, you've kind of gone from Christian megachurch pastor to spiritual wanderer. Is that a pretty fair summary?
I don't know. I don't know. I think wander is an interesting archetype, and I certainly feel that energy at times. I think I felt much more restless when I was a pastor, as if I was in the wrong place. I think my wandering started a long time ago. And I think leaving a megachurch was much more like the beginning of a homecoming than it was the beginning of a wander. But it's hard to make a hard and fast lines when it comes to this sort of stuff.
I like that. I like the way you put that. And so you were the pastor at Mars Hill, and you were Rob Bell's successor, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you were there for about, so I looked you up on Wikipedia to get the dates right, but it looks like you're there for about 4 years.
Yeah, well, I had a much longer history with Mars Hill, actually. So Rob used to work for my dad when he first became a pastor, and then Rob started Mars Hill, and I did the music at the beginning of Mars Hill, so for the first 4 years, and then went away to graduate school in Israel, and then I was kind of in and out of Mars Hill as a teacher, and so occasionally doing music until Rob left, and then I took his job. So when I left Mars Hill, I had been a part of that, a part of it for 17 years since the day it started, kind of coming in and out of the community. So it was a big chapter in my life. It wasn't just sort of a 4-year blitz.
In regards to that Wikipedia, I just got to share this with you. I thought you might appreciate it. So I was like, you might need to put this on a resume someday. So I should share this with you if you didn't already have this language. So on the Wikipedia site under Mars Hill Church, it said, following Rob Bell's departure, a national search was conducted, and in August 2012, it was announced that Kent Dobson would take over the role as teaching pastor. I was like, man.
You know what's funny?
Yeah.
So here's some insider info. There was a national search, and they really couldn't find anyone. It was like
no one that they liked or what?
Yeah, I mean, would you want to follow Rob?
Good point.
Yeah, and I think anyone who maybe had a voice and a name, which is kind of maybe something they were looking for, just didn't want to touch that. Like, did they want to be associated with Rob's former church? And Rob was kind of he wasn't the evangelical golden boy anymore. So it was, who would take that? But it didn't bother me because I was already I knew the people, I knew the elders, I knew the community, I knew what I was getting myself into, and I guess because Rob is a friend, I didn't feel like it was. I didn't have to fill his spot. I just had to do my thing. So it felt like kind of a natural transition to me. But the website does make it, Wikipedia makes it sound more dramatic than it was. It was more like they couldn't find anyone, and they asked me to apply. Like, would you consider it? And it took me a little while to, I don't know, mull it over in my head, because I was teaching high school at a local high school here in Grand Rapids. I was teaching religion and Bible at a Christian school, and I liked it. It was a really rewarding job. Although, I had my own theological questions about Christianity, but it was a generous place to work and to even ask questions. So I was relatively content there. It wasn't a simple and easy decision, I guess I would say.
That's cool. I always love getting the backside of the story, because there's always the alternate narrative, and it's always fun to be like, oh no, I just knew a guy,
Yeah.
That's awesome. So since leaving your place at Mars Hill, you've been doing a lot of stuff. You've been writing, you've been podcasting, diving deep into the natural world, leading those retreats. And and I just got to say, like, kind of out of that season, you wrote this book, Bitten by a Camel. And that was just such a beautiful book. And I just wanted to tell you how much that book meant to me and how beautiful I thought it was. And you just did such a beautiful job with that, and really just bring a breath of fresh air to this process of deconstruction that's so heavy, and so many people just get so bent out of shape over. I just loved your book, and I would recommend it for anybody going through it. Because,
hey, thank you.
The way you handled it.
Yeah, thanks. It was hard to write. It was hard to be personal and try to tell a bit of my own story in an authentic way. but it also felt like the right thing to do. And I'm glad you enjoyed it. I did hope that anyone who sort of is going through their own kind of deconstruction wander, that it helps in some way. At the very least, it says you're not alone, and this is not so unusual. At least that's some of my intention.
And that's exactly what I felt from it. There's that quote that you have from that spiritual director in it. Something along the lines of, everything you're going through is normal. You're lucky to have all these experiences. Like, just kind of calm down. That was really the theme of the whole book. It's fantastic. But no, it's funny that you mentioned that that was a challenge for you to write something so personal. Because, before we talked, I was thinking about like this in contrast to your podcast. And it's like, yeah, I dig your podcast, but it's completely different. It's like all about like depth psychology and like models and like archetypes. And, it's very, very content heavy, I guess, might be a good way to put it.
Yeah. I probably have that tendency to sort of fly up into the content realm and move around in that space. And my editor was just always hammering me, saying, "Hey, who cares about your ideas, man? They're good and all, but tell me about your life." And even with my podcast, I don't have an editor, obviously, but it does run through my mind occasionally. Okay, well, how can I come back down to earth here? Because any kind of maps, models, archetypes, ideas, themes, theology, there has to be a ground on which you're wandering around. And real life is more ambiguous than models anyway. So you're just encouraging me to be more personal whenever I can.
No, I mean, I just think that's awesome that you got the bandwidth for both. You know what I mean? It's like you're talented at doing both ends of the spectrum, and I think that's really cool.
Yeah, thanks.
But really why I wanted to bring you on the show today to talk about is some stuff that I heard recently on your podcast that was just really, really intriguing. And so your podcast, it's called Hints and Guesses. And earlier this year, you started doing this We've Lost the Plot series, subtitle, Recovering the Great Stories. And, that sounds kind of ambiguous, but on the show notes of the first episode, here's what you wrote is, "To my own surprise, I keep returning to the Bible, a book that allures and repulses, inspires and confronts." And then you say some other stuff. But, up until this point, I had felt a movement away from the Bible and away from Christianity pretty strongly from you. And, you still got like that, you were a pastor, you got that education, so you still like incorporated that into your work, but it just seemed like you're really geared towards leaving that behind. So and I like that. I mean, I dig that. But when this series came out, I saw it and I read that description. I kind of rolled my eyes and I'm like, oh, can't. I'm losing you. But no, you just had some really interesting thoughts. Like once I finally decided to listen to it, and not that far into the first episode, you make this comment that the Bible is part of the collective Western psyche. Unpack that a little bit for me.
Okay. Yeah. So to speak personally, what do I mean by I keep returning to stories? I don't mean I go and read my Bible or go listen to sermons about people talking about the Bible. I mean, the stories occur to me kind of as I am doing my own spiritual wrestling match. It's like the archetypal energies of them still feel alive, or they reverberate with something. And that's kind of what I mean by they come to me as a surprise. Like I've made a big deal in some of my podcast writings and teachings about actually how we started the conversation, the archetype of the wanderer, that in order to grow up, you have to leave home. And that seems to be universal in all kinds of myths and stories and legends and poems and even artwork. And you're not going to grow up if you don't leave home. Well, I mean, that is the Abraham story. It's like, and where does that story sit? And that's what I mean about the collective unconscious. It's not just personal, like, well, I was raised a Christian, I was told these stories. I think they sit actually in the Western psyche. And people don't come in. One of the things we're learning from depth psychology is that we don't come into the world as blank slates. We know that from a biological point of view, just like you have a DNA and but now we know it on the level of personality in terms of traits, and also something of the archetypes of the psyche. At least that's according to depth psychology. And I don't know, the Western world, which is now swallowing up more and more of the entire globe, has some major streams flowing into it. One is Greek philosophy and Greco-Roman social norms, and the other is the Bible. These images, characters, themes, symbols, probably symbols more than anything else. So one reason why I wanted to do a series, We've Lost the Plot, is that I kind of thought the move was going to be, well, everybody's kind of outgrowing the Bible. They're like, kind of old stories, and it's just time to move on. But if they're really in the Western psyche, it doesn't work that way. You can't just decide, I'm not into that. Something of your own, the shape of what gives life meaning or not is influenced by that thing. And we know that culturally speaking, there are all kinds of biblical influences. And the way to move around in them is to turn toward them, not to just ignore them and say, I don't know, I'm not into this. You know that song, the Beatles song, Imagine No Religion? Or it's a John Lennon song, Imagine No Religion. And it's a lovely thought, but that's just not the way imagination works. Like the psyche is influenced, or I should say, the psyche influences our consciousness, and you can't just imagine no religion. It's like in the substructure of who we are. And it's much more like, let's dive into that and do our own sifting and sorting. I don't know. It just feels alluring. Like I said in that introduction, there's something alluring about it and repulsive. And that tells me that it's more potent than people think.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I heard somebody say the other day, just like, in regards to, really staunch atheism, it's like, okay, like, even if you accomplish your goal and like everybody becomes an atheist and nobody believes in God anymore, it's like the day after that, like somebody's going to invent God, just because it's just like baked into the psyche.
That's what Carl Jung says. He says if you could wipe the psyche clean, I'm paraphrasing, if you could wipe it clean and there's no symbolic images anymore, and what he would call the God archetype, the next day humanity would invent new ones. It's just, we're like meaning-making, symbol-making machines for questions of what's ultimately true. And the funny thing about atheism is that it's a search for ultimate truth by saying there's no God. And so it's the same thing. It's the same structure. That then is God. It's the same thing. It's trying to answer questions of ultimate meaning. And but it just kind of has this like ironic twist. I know for sure, ultimately, there is no God. That's an ultimate claim, and at least it's longing for that. So the impulse isn't any different, at least in my view.
Yeah, no, I'm right there with you. It's like I definitely lean toward the atheistic, like humanistic description of things. But it's like if I get going like down that road and I just talk about it in that way, it's like that's boring. That's a very short road. It's like, cool, you believe a thing. Like, what now?
Yeah. It requires a lot of faith in in the human rational faculties, and that's a good thing. We are unique creatures that have evolved with this rational faculty, but to turn that into certitude and an only materialistic worldview, that's the same faith, in my opinion, that a fundamentalist Christian has. I know that I know. You know, like a Baptist line we always use, I know that I know. You hear that similar kind of vein with humanism in its most extreme forms, I think. So, yeah.
Yeah, something else you said in your first installment of that, We Lost the Plot, was that the psyche speaks in images, metaphors, and symbols, and it's old.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. We know this as a fact. Like, even little kids, 3, 4 years old, have dreams. And in their dreams, there's all kinds of what we could call archetypal imagery. And they're not getting it from storybooks that their parents read them. It's built in. And the Bible moves around in the archetypes. I mean, the life, death, life of all things, that's a universal archetype in all religions and spirituality. Something like death and resurrection, that's the Christian symbol of it. We locate it, or Christians locate it in a particular person, but the archetype is just the same. And it seems to be part of how we make sense. It's the symbolic map sort of behind our consciousness.
Yeah. No, I love your work because you're always zooming like way far out, you know, and you're not just looking at like, you know, the model, like, okay, how does Christianity work, or how does, you know, this work? You're zooming way out and you're looking at everything. It's like, okay, how do models work, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that's caused you to stir up a fair amount of trouble too.
Yeah. Some people like it and some people get a little freaked out.
Uh-huh.
It's kind of disappointing if you're a Christian and you hear death and resurrection, you know, hello, that's like all over the place. Check out, you know, Horus, the Egyptian god, or whatever. There are certain corn myths and stories from Native American landscape that is really about death and resurrection, or the life, death, life cycle, all things to say if it's true somewhere, in a sense, it's true everywhere on the symbolic level. So it's kind of disappointing. The Christian defense is, yeah, but ours is the real one. But you know, it's just that's kind of a silly argument to make. I think in the end, it's actually just participating in something that human beings have intuited in different ways. That there's a kind of eternity, and I don't mean heaven, like people hanging out. I mean in the turning over of things, in the life, death, life. You know.
It's just
just
another thing to be explored.
Yeah, 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 and and I mean, maybe one more thing about the Bible. I just think another reason why I wanted to do We've Lost the Plot is that for many people, they don't care. They're like, I don't really care about the Bible. So in one sense, I'm trying to say, hey, let's look at it again, just out of curiosity, and see if there's something beneath the surface way in which it's being used. That's maybe one hope. But the other is that the Bible is also seriously misused by politicians and pastors and different kinds of ideological camps. And I think by looking more carefully at it, it dismantles some of those misuses rather than wishing it would just go away. Like, no, let's let the story or even the person of Jesus challenge the ideological co-opting that happens. Just look at the story and see if that's really what it's saying, or something like that. So
Yeah, it's
I
like
don't
we
know.
all want something to hang our hats on at some point, but there's also this need to encourage that push into deeper exploration of things,
Yeah,
like that need to go out into the unknown and be that wanderer, go on the hero's journey.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, part of this I just learned from living in Israel and having some Jewish professors and teachers and rabbis as part of my academic work. They hold the stories so differently than I had learned to hold them. And that is with curiosity and wonder, and as if they're bottomless, and as if you are only scratching the surface. I mean, and that's that's a much more life-giving way of listening anyway. Just, I don't know, they do seem bottomless, and that's how they survived. They have that kind of depth, and that's what made them worth telling and retelling in the first place.
Yeah, and talking about Judaism, kind of going back to this like Christian atheist thing, it's like I think it's really cool in Jewish culture how you can be like a non-practicing Jew, but you're still like Jewish, and
Well, it's an ethnicity.
yeah. But it's like you're still part of the tradition, even though it's like you're not in the tradition. It's kind of a cool dynamic,
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny. I thought about this before because, I have loads of friends in Israel that are secular Jews, and what does that mean exactly? Well, I don't even know if they would say they would believe in God. First of all, that's not very important in Judaism anyway, your beliefs. But it's like, yeah, we keep the Sabbath occasionally. We might go to the synagogue. We might not. We might get our kids circumcised. But is there a God? I don't know. Maybe. But being Jewish is also being in conversation with the tradition of Judaism. And something like, I used to wonder if something like a secular Christian is emerging, where like a secular Christian might say something similar. I don't know if I believe these things, or I don't know if Jesus really got up out of the tomb, but I'm in conversation with the big symbols and patterns, and at the darkest time of the year, we celebrate the dawning of light, the winter solstice and the birth of Jesus, and just to see that as part of culture, for one thing, but also part of our back to what I was saying before, that the maps that are in our psyches. Anyway, I don't know if I can coin that phrase, a secular Christian, but something like that.
I like that term, secular Christian. Like, I think there's some mileage to it, because I'm always just trying to play around with language, like to find something that resonates and like describes me well to people, right? And recently I'm like, okay, like mystical humanism, maybe
that's pretty good.
Maybe there's
that's
something to that, like like humanism that's held loosely,
That's actually a nice way to say it.
I like that secular Christian. It still kind of holds
mystical humanism.
It holds the roots. Yeah, but the mystical humanism, that kind of like, it goes back to the thing we were talking about earlier, where it's like, okay, just throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like, this isn't my tradition anymore. Like, my tradition is science, where it used to be religion. Anyway, secular Christianism. We're gonna go with secular Christianism.
I know. Hopefully, we don't need more isms in the world. But
no, you're totally right. Like, we just need to talk more and like function off of more basic labels.
Yeah.
So you recently did this series on the Enneagram too. Like, tell me a little bit about that and the backlash you got from it.
I did get a little backlash. I got like some friendly hate about it.
Okay.
And maybe it's just a few people who's like, I'm not listening to this guy anymore. But most people, I think, appreciated some level of critique. So I've known about the Enneagram through Richard Rohr's work for a long time. I mean, since like 2003, something like that, or 2004. And initially I found it pretty helpful in the sense of, hey, there are patterns of motivation. I think that's a good way of saying it. Motivation, not just behavior, but sort of motivation and behavior. And different people have different patterns and different hang-ups. And where things started to go awry for me was in different working environments, like at Mars Hill and also in some of my friend groups, where the Enneagram, these 9 points, which usually comes out of the Sufi Gurdjieff tradition, these 9 points of the Enneagram turn into 9 personality traits, and it's like a fun parlor game to figure out where you are, and then map the whole world. Well, so-and-so's a 5 and so-and-so's a 2, and I don't work well with 8s, and, pretty soon that explains the entire universe. And that's where I just started to have some aversion. I was like, this can't be good. And then the further I dove into sort of depth psychology and personalities and subpersonalities, and even a phrase like I am a 5 or I am a 4 is problematic. Who is the I that's speaking? And just because you act or even are motivated in a certain way, how much of that is a sub-personality, meaning an energy that hooks you and is at war with other sub-personalities? I know I'm using like psychological language, but and how much of that is what we might call the authentic self. These are very hard things to navigate. And I think I put this in my podcast, but maybe it's worth saying. Jung says, when you are practicing psychotherapy, remember the person in front of you is not a statistic. They're a mystery, and they're a mystery to themselves. And that kind of kneecaps the tendency we all have to label ourselves and label other people as if that's the end of the story. No, you're a mystery, and you're a mystery to yourself. And the soul is not a number. That's the thing I would just stake my claim on. Whatever we mean by soul, like some sort of deep way of being in the world, and that is one's wild, unique essence, is beneath any kind of framework like the Enneagram or Myers-Briggs or the lighter versions of personality tests. At least that's a conviction that I have. And the more you sort of date, in a way, the mystery of who you are, I think that's a much more humble way of going on a journey of self than it is the path of easy labels. Because I know for sure that it keeps people stuck, and they use the Enneagram as an excuse. Well, sorry, I'm an 8. That's just what I do. And I just want to say, wait a minute. Talk about stopping growth or change in its tracks. And that's what the ego loves. It's like addicted to labels, categories, and identities. And any spiritual tradition says that growth looks like disidentification. And you don't see that in Enneagram work. On the surface, someone who really knows, be like, wait a minute, Russ Hudson says, some of the other really great Enneagram teachers do talk about disidentification, but it's sort of like, it's down there a bit. It's not right on the surface. Anyway, I hope I've made some sense.
No. So there is a little bit of material out there around this. You said disidentification and the Enneagram.
Well, just disidentification, period, is good spiritual teaching.
Okay, gotcha.
Like Buddhism 101 is you have no self, and that the self is a kind of illusion, and disidentification looks like letting go of that. What I'm saying is that way of talking about spiritual growth doesn't get brought in very often to Enneagram talk when people are like, actually, I am a whatever. I'm a 2. Now I know who I am. I would say that's an illusion of the ego, or I might suggest. Sometimes I might suggest it's an illusion of the ego.
I had this great experience probably like 4 years ago where I was just like, what am I? Kind of when I'm in the deep feels of like deconstruction and tearing everything apart. And I was like, what am I? What am I? I don't know what I am anymore. Then one day, I was listening to a bunch of podcasts on the way home. I'm like, oh, okay. I finally know what I am. And I came up with some crazy term. Like, I'm a post-Christian, evangelical, something, humanist, blah, blah, blah. I was like, oh, that feels good. So I went to bed, and then the next morning I woke up, and I'm like, that's too limiting. Like,
yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying.
Something fun about dynamics.
And maybe both things are needed. Like, you need the anxiety of, that's even St. Francis. Who are you, God, and who am I? The who am I is a real question. And part of that search means you have to explore the personas you have, and any tool will help. So, like, I'm a fan of the Enneagram because it puts people on the journey of self-discovery. It's just has some limitations, and it's not the only one out there.
It's like undulations. We're talking about models and like the model of models and all that. And have you ever been like on a mountain bike or something and ridden those rollers?
Yeah.
It's just like, sure. And somehow, like, I don't even know how it works, right? But it's kind of like swinging. You just like pump yourself through, and somehow you get going faster without even pedaling.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, one model, next model, like this model, boom. Then you're cruising. It's like, whoa.
Yeah. And maybe the point is to keep going downhill, to keep moving, not to like stop on one and be like, I've reached the pinnacle.
Yeah, for sure. And I totally agree with that. Oh, okay, so in your life, what's the model that's speaking to you and teaching you things about the world currently, even if it's ultimately gonna fail? Like, what model are you finding beauty in right now?
Yeah, well, the last few years, I've really been into the work of Bill Plotkin. So he's a psychotherapist and wilderness guide, and he has an institute called the Animas Valley Institute. It's in Durango, Colorado, and I have been doing various programs. In fact, as soon as I left Mars Hill, as soon as I quit my job, I entered into like a year-long program with them. And so I continue in that orbit, and now I'm in their training program. It's more of an apprenticeship, and for doing this kind of work, nature-based guiding that has a sort of a psychological depth dimension to it. And so his work, he's got 3 books, about to have another one. Another one's coming out pretty soon, but Nature and the Human Soul, a book called Wild Mind, which is a map of human wholeness using the 4 cardinal directions, north, south, east, west. And he's got another one called Soulcraft, which is kind of the process of the shift from, I'm going to use some of his language, kind of conformist, a conformist adolescent to the shift into a wanderer, a kind of descent, a descent to soul is really what the book Soulcraft is about. So not only does it describe what that journey is like, but it gives you some nature-based practices that can enhance that. So that's the work that's been ringing my bell. And that's one reason why I just got back from a retreat. Like I'm finding my own way of turning some of this stuff around in my own unique way. And I just find it rewarding. And plus, I mean, who would not agree that we, human cultures, right now do not have a very healthy relationship with the natural world. And so besides the psychological and spiritual stuff that goes on in kind of nature-based work, it's also just good to be outside and renew what is natural. It's not like, I mean, we are nature. It's not like some people who shop at REI are into nature. Everybody is nature. And that kind of deepening that relationship, how else are we going to care for the home that we have unless we have a relationship with it. So it has like a, I don't know, it has its own gifts regardless of the model. Actually, that's, maybe I should say one more thing about it. One of the cool things about leading programs in which you are outside and encouraging people to go on different kinds of wanders is that they have unique experiences. They go on a wander, they feel a connection with this or that, or a plant or an animal, or even a whole scene, a whole area, a valley, and it's like you're trusting that something of the soul resonates with the earth, and something of your way of being resonates with the wild world. And that's what's so amazing about taking people outside like this, because you never know what people are going to encounter and bring up and what questions it's going to drag up. And so it's unpredictable in like a beautiful kind of way. Anyway, so that's the kind of work I've been into recently and been influenced by.
That's really cool. No, hearing you talk, it's like, it's kind of connecting some dots in my mind, because I remember having this experience like, 3-4 years ago. I went on a work retreat, and we were all just like riding ATVs through the woods in the mountains of Colorado, and it was a blast, right? But there was nobody there that was like quite like the depth of person that I was. Or maybe I just suck at being generally social, but it's like riding this ATV like through the woods alone. It's like, man, I had a deep, like rich experience, like an archetypal experience might be the language you put on it, but it was just rich, and it was good, and it was deep, and it was like I was wild man on the ATV, and that was good for my soul. But I was like, oh
yeah, for
man,
sure.
There's nobody to like go and talk about it with, because I'm kind of like with these kind of frat boy type people, and I'm just like, oh, I'm having this deep experience, and everybody else is playing beer pong.
Yeah.
But no, it sounds like that's what your
kind of
retreats offer, and I'm like, that's beautiful. That's really cool.
Yeah. Yeah, and the wild man is an archetype. It's in the book Iron John by Robert Bly, which is one of my all-time favorite books. Another book that changed my life for sure. But
I've made it about a third of the way
myth,
through that, and it's
it's
that's a challenging read. Ooh,
yeah,
man,
it's a challenging read.
I need to pick it back up, but
yeah, I've probably read that book 3 or 4 times. In fact, I tried. After the first read, I realized, okay, this isn't a book that can just be consumed and understood. It's very poetic, and it's maybe something that kind of works on you over time as you sort of like come in and out of it. And that's the way myths work anyway. They don't equal something. Oh, this equals this. It's more like the image, the symbol, the energy kind of works on you. But people, even frat boys, part of the frat boy thing is just an immature expression, in my opinion, of something good, which is the wild person, the wild man, the wild woman. It's not just a masculine thing. But that kind of wild, indigenous, rootedness. After all, we evolved up out of the forest. We're forest beings. And, and just cutting loose one day on an ATV and drinking too much beer is an immature expression of a desire that's good, which is a return to wildness, one's own wildness, and the wild world. Nothing makes you feel more alive than kind of the beauty and terror of being in wild places. It's not like just everything is one and bliss. A lightning bolt can kill you. I've had a grizzly bear walk into the stream that I was standing in with a cub, 20 feet away from me. And that's an enlivening experience and terrifying at the same time. But it's ancient, and you realize, okay, I'm not the center of the universe. I'm a part of this wild web, and I don't know. We need more of that.
Yeah.
in the world, I think.
Yeah, those are my best experiences, like in life,
Hmm.
when I'm in nature and I've become part of it. I'm not separate from
Hmm.
it, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I mean, that's mystical. Mystical humanism, whatever you want to call it. Any sense of union is what people ordinarily mean by transcendence or mystical non-dual union, if you want to sound super fancy. And we need a taste of that from time to time. It too is part of the human experience.
So
Yeah.
I'll ask you one more question, then we'll kind of start
Sure.
closing it out here. But
Okay.
what's the craziest thing you've seen as you've been hanging out in the natural world?
Well, one time I was on a podcast with Pete Holmes, and I started talking about a vision quest that I did, a contemporary version of it. I don't mean like a traditional native Lakota vision quest, but where I'm outside not eating for 4 days alone. And he was sort of comparing it to like some mushroom journeys he was on. And he wanted to know what happened out there. And I suddenly thought of this line from a poem, which was, "Tell a wise person or else be silent." And that's the first thing that comes to my mind. Like, even what you're describing on the four-wheeler, like, to bring additional language to that is actually really hard and difficult to translate. So the wildest things that I've experienced, I guess I would say, are something like visions, or dreams I had that it was kind of hard to tell if I was awake or if I was still dreaming. And it's like I experienced a kind of intelligence in the natural world that was talking with my own psyche that's a bit hard to explain. And I don't know, that maybe that's just part of the vision fast anyway. It's like an altered state of consciousness. And I might say I experienced an altered state of consciousness. But the specifics of it, I want to hold on to. These specific images, I want to hold on to. I'll maybe give you one example that's kind of a bit odd. So I did, do you know what deep imagination journeys are?
I don't.
Okay, it sounds kind of fancier than it is, but it's guided meditation. That's another way to say it. So like close your eyes and this, and this. You're on a walk. I could just make one up right now. Close your eyes and we're wandering out into the forest. And anyway, somebody was guiding this sort of meditation journey, and they said, now an obstacle appears in front of you. And what appeared in front of me in my imagination was the shape, the outline of a torso of a man. Okay? So just imagine the outline. You come up the shoulders and then the neck and then the head and then back down again. Just the torso, and the torso was on fire. Okay? Now, I've been into this kind of stuff for a while, so I wasn't making any judgments about it. I wasn't like, what does it mean? That's what appeared. They said an obstacle appears in front of you. So it was like a torso that was kind of on fire. And whatever, I don't even remember the rest of where the journey went. But I remember drawing it when I was done. Maybe that was an instruction, like, oh, just draw whatever obstacle appeared in front of you. And so I did. I drew the torso of a man that was on fire and put it away and didn't think about it again. And about a year later, I was doing a fast in the wilderness. And it was maybe day 3 or 4, so near the end. And I decided I was going to go out on a little walk. And I don't know if you've ever done any fasting, but it's not I experienced not a lot of hunger. Like, I wasn't hungry out there. I mean, I was a little bit, but I wasn't very conscious of it. But I was tired. Like, I didn't have a lot of energy. So I was like, I'm going to go on a very slow walk. And I walked down this canyon, and I was in Utah. And I rounded this corner, and there in front of me was a tree that had fallen over, and the roots had made the perfect shape that I had drawn in my journal. The torso of a man. And it had been struck by lightning, so it was charred, as if it was on fire. And something like an arrow, that's what it felt like, just ran right through me, meaning I was that shocked. I even kind of like looked around like what is happening? Because I hadn't thought about that image for a year. And now, I kind of turned, maybe I'm not going to say more about that, but that's what I mean. That's maybe a synchronicity, a strange connection, a conversation that's happening between my psyche and its imagination and the natural world. And I mean, you could just say, maybe a skeptic would say, well, these are all just random brain firings, and who knows what the imagination anyway, it's just chemicals, and you're making these connections up, and whatever. So what? If all of that's true, I still couldn't make that up if I tried. That I would imagine such a thing, and a year later I would encounter that, and it would, like, it almost struck me like a grief. That when I say the arrow running through me, I mean, I think I burst into tears for a second, because that's how shocked I was. And it did seem to be saying, at the very least, there's more meaning and connection in the universe than you know anything about. Maybe that was the place it took me. It was humbling. And what do I do with that? I don't know. I let it be. I don't try to make too much meaning of it. I just say it has meaning, but I'm not exactly sure how to explain it. And maybe I'd say one other thing. It felt like maybe this is me interpreting this. It felt something like this old man or old way of being in the world was being struck by lightning, was burning up, was an obstacle to me, and I had to let that go. And in a way, that was maybe one intention that I took away from that experience. Like, okay, my old life, this half a man, is being burnt up in a spiritual sense or in a symbolic and metaphoric sense. And this is only confirming that I can't go back. I can't go back to the old Kent, pastor man, or whatever personas and roles I've been carrying. Not that it's that simple to never go back, but that's the way it felt. So that's a hard thing to talk about. And I don't think I've ever actually, maybe then just to a few people I've told that story to, but that's an example of the kind of stuff that can happen when you open yourself up to the wild world and you allow the unconscious to have a voice in your life instead of just the ego. And the unconscious is the labyrinth that's beneath the surface, the iceberg that's beneath the waterline of who you think you are. So I don't know. How's that?
Man, that's a cool story. That's a cool story. Definitely sounds like one of those moments where it's like you can never describe how profound it was.
Yeah.
It's like you see something crazy with your buddy, and like, nothing can quite match nothing can quite match the communion that you feel when you look at your buddy and you're like, dude, that was crazy. And then you try to explain it to everybody else and you're like, no, you don't get it. You don't get it.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's what I'm saying. It's hard to explain. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I got one last question for you, and that's just, what are you up to now? What, any new books on the way? What are you working on?
I am working on a new book. I hesitate to say, because I don't want to turn people off to it. But I started working on a new book on Jesus. What I'm thinking of, not as a title, but I'm thinking of an archetypal Christ, not the Christ of history or even the historical Jesus. That was part of my obsession. That's why I moved to Israel. Like, who was the historical Jewish guy that walked around and the guy behind Christianity? But I'm curious into the layer that's even beneath that. So not the American Jesus is my boyfriend, nor the Christ of theology, nor the historical Jesus, but the archetypal Christ. That something of his life story seems to have certain stages or phases that are patterns of a life transformed. I don't mean it's the only path of transformation. I mean, it's a pattern of a life transformed. And I just started getting curious about that. So that's what I'm working on. I don't know if it will be a book. I've got about 12 symbols that are connected to Jesus that I've come up with. So I'm working away. My last book, Bitten by a Camel, I said yes to a book contract before I had a good idea, which is not that smart. I'm doing it in reverse order. I'm doing it in the traditional order. I'm trying to see if I can really come up with something before I see if anyone is interested. But I'm working away at that, and I'm getting ready to roll out over the next couple of years a lot more retreats and programs that are more sort of nature-based and soul oriented. So those two things are taking up my time.
Very cool.
Yep.
Well,
mm-hmm.
I, the topic of Jesus doesn't interest me too much typically, but I would love to see what you do with that. That sounds super interesting.
Yeah.
I'd love to see where you take it.
Yeah. Well, I originally got the idea because I teach at a place called C3 here in Grand Haven, Michigan, which is about 40 minutes from my house. And they call themselves an inclusive spiritual community. And I do about half of the Sundays a year there. And I'm going to make up percentages right now. Let's say 10% are atheists, another 10% are maybe agnostics, and then a whole range of other spiritual traditions. Some are Christian or post-Christian, but maybe they have a general, it has sort of a progressive vibe there. But anyway, a couple years ago, I did a series on Jesus, and people liked it and didn't like it at the same time. Like, it made some people nervous, like, really? Where are we going with this? We don't want to go backwards. And then other people are like, this is really interesting. So for the same reasons that I'm doing we've lost the plot with the Bible, it's alluring and repulsive. And that's how I feel about Jesus. He's alluring and repulsive. People don't want to talk about it, and they kind of do. So that's why I'm diving in to see if anything will come of it.
And that's what I'm saying. You like to stir up a fair amount of trouble, it seems like. So
I'm not trying that hard. It finds me as much as I'm looking for it, I guess.
That's good that you go wherever, it makes sense for you to go, and you bring some people along with you. I think that's really cool.
Yeah, thanks. Well, good. Yeah, appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much for taking the time to talk. This has been great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. Keep up the good work of, it's funny. It's like grounded presence. I have to be honest. I'm oftentimes not very grounded or present, but I need both of those things in my life. So thanks for contributing to that desire and to the great conversation, in your own unique way.
I'm neither of those things either most of the time, but I try. It's all about trying to get closer to it, riding those cycles until you're a little bit closer. So
yeah, exactly.
Well, if you want to find out more about Kent and his work, check out his website, kentdobson.com. And as always, make sure to follow The Grounded Presence on Facebook and Instagram and on Twitter. And Additionally, make sure to subscribe to the podcast in whatever app you use to stay up to date with the latest releases. And if you're digging the show and you want to help it grow, please rate and review the show on iTunes and consider sharing an episode with a friend.